I caught my cheating wife's ex-husband giving her a wedding ring at a romantic dinner, so I went to their table and said, "Surprise, I discovered everything and caught you two here, now I'm going to reveal to everyone who you really are," and at that moment, time seemed to freeze, her eyes widened as if she had seen a ghost, and the ex, with an almost rehearsed expression of cynicism, just smiled. That scene, which would seem absurd or even ridiculous in any other context, was the breaking point of my existence. Because there, in front of my cheating wife, who for months had looked me in the eyes saying she loved me, who pretended to touch my face tenderly before going to sleep, who cooked my favorite dishes on Sundays, there she was, feasting in a luxury restaurant with the man who one day left her for someone else. The same man who now, apparently, was back on the stage of her life, with a ring and everything. But what they didn't know, what absolutely no one suspected that night, was that every step of that performance had been planned, by me. In the days leading up to that night, every detail of my life had become a stage for doubt. Her kisses started to change. Small absences began to seem like bottomless holes. A new perfume on clothes. A muffled conversation that ended when they saw me enter the room. And the worst, the silence. That enigmatic, treacherous silence that only exists between two people who no longer share the truth. It was this silence that led me to investigate. Not out of distrust, but out of desperation. I wasn't ready to lose. I couldn't bear to be betrayed. I, who had emotionally rebuilt myself to love after years of a lonely life, I, who gave her my past and all my plans for the future. I, who never imagined that, in the end, she would choose exactly that man. It wasn't difficult to figure out the pattern. A dinner always scheduled at the same times, careful departures but not discreet enough for a good observer, and an almost cynical detail, she wore the same lipstick she wore on our first dates when she knew she was going to see him. And that hurt more than any carnal betrayal. She didn't just see him, she wanted him, with the same ardor with which she once said she loved me. Each new clue took away a little of my skin. But it was necessary to continue. Because something inside me screamed that it wasn't enough to just find out. I needed to expose. I needed to break that sweet facade she put on in front of our friends, our family, even me. I needed to reveal to the world the kind of woman she really was. It was then that the idea came up. I found out where the next dinner was. I booked a table next door. I chose an outfit that she praised for our wedding anniversary, just to see the expression melt on her face. And more than that, I prepared myself for the show. I arrived early, sat at the corner table, ordered an expensive wine, and watched, like someone watching their own life fall apart in slow motion. They greeted each other like teenagers, smiled like accomplices in a well-constructed lie. When he took the box out of his pocket, and she, almost in tears, put her hands to her mouth, I knew, this was the moment. I got up. I walked to their table like someone walking into an emotional war. I felt my heart pounding in my ears, my hands were sweating, but I knew there was no going back. Surprise was all I could say at first, and when they both looked at me with the confused expression of someone who was caught in their own game, I continued with my voice choked with anger that I had been building up for months. I found out everything. I caught you two here. Now I'm going to reveal to everyone who you really are. Her reaction was a vivid portrait of guilt. Eyes teary, mouth half open, unable to utter a single word. He, with a smile disguised as mockery, just said, "Calm down, man, you don't understand," and that's when I knew he had no idea who he was dealing with. Because, contrary to what they both thought, that dinner wasn't just any romantic reunion. It was a trap. That ring that he handed over as if it were a symbol of redemption was nothing more than a piece on the board that I had set up myself. In the previous days, I had made contact with him. Pretending to be someone else, approaching as if interested in business. I gained your trust. I discovered your weaknesses. Your reasons. Your desperation to start over. And I was the one who led him to her. I was the one who encouraged each message, each meeting. Everything planned to the millimeter. He hadn't come back for love. He came back because he needed something that she had, and that he believed he could still handle. Little did he know that he was being manipulated by me. Every step of that man, every word spoken, every flower delivered, were rehearsed to make her take the bait. And she bit. Willingly. She gave herself up. Not him. But the idea of being desired by someone who had already discarded her in the past. Her ego spoke louder than any feeling she claimed to have for me. And when she agreed to meet him in that restaurant, when she smiled when she saw that ring being offered, she sealed her own fate. But the cruelest part was yet to come. Because what she didn't know, and neither did he, is that in that restaurant there were not only customers, but witnesses. Witnesses who were warned. Who knew exactly what they were going to witness. Friends, relatives, co-workers. People who until then had seen her as an example of a wife, a balanced woman, an impeccable professional. And there, in that crowded restaurant, with the lights low and the ambient sound playing something too romantic for the occasion, I made a point of revealing who she was. Who they both really were. The shame on her face was almost as strong as the pleasure of seeing her break her pose in front of everyone. The tears that fell were not of regret. They were desperate. Because she understood, too late, that she had been played into her own game. And lost. His expression of disbelief, when he realized that all of this was an act created by me, confirmed to me that I had won. But what came after, oh, what came after was even more impactful. Because the real blow was yet to come. This was all just the first layer of the plan. And what no one that night could imagine was what I actually prepared for her. The real reason behind my exposure. The most painful secret she would ever think would come from me. And when it is revealed, nothing, absolutely nothing in her life will be the same as before. Neither does her ex-husband. Not even friends. Nor the career. Not even the name she built. Because when you betray the one who loved you most, the world can silently turn against you. And now, the question that hasn't left anyone's mind since that night, what was the real reason that led me to set all this up? What did I really know? And what did I save for the end, as the last and cruelest chapter in this story of love and betrayal? Everything will be revealed. But not now. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support or romanticize any type of betrayal. All stories told are fictitious, but based on real emotions that show how betrayal can destroy lives, homes and futures. Our objective is one, show the pain that lies cause and the price it takes. Get ready. You're about to hear a shocking story, intense and unforgettable. Good story. They met on a cloudy autumn afternoon, the kind where the air seems suspended and the world moves slower. It was in a corner cafe, on a random street in the center, where fate, or chance, decided to intertwine two lives that seemed too complete to look for something new. His name was Daniel, and her name was Elena. He, a methodical architect, accustomed to exact calculations and straight lines, lived a predictable but comfortable daily life. She, a civil lawyer, was pure intensity, full of impulses and certainties that changed suddenly, like the seasons. Daniel was 38, Elena was 35. Both had experienced previous relationships, disappointments that left slight but persistent marks, like small cracks beneath the fresh paint of a freshly painted wall. When they met, none of these wounds seemed relevant. They were both ready, they believed. At first, the relationship progressed with the elegance and distraction typical of adult love. They admired each other deeply. Daniel was enchanted by the way Elena could position herself firmly in any situation, without fear of appearing harsh or harsh. She, on the other hand, saw in him a type of security that she had never known, a man who listened, who pondered, who spoke little, but with surgical precision. Conversations flowed as if they had been written before being spoken. Within months, the relationship became inevitable. Together, they bought a loft in a quiet and charming area of the city. They decorated everything with their hands, mixing Daniel's sophisticated minimalism with Elena's bold and sentimental choices. It was the home they both always wanted, without ever being able to define exactly what it would be like. Sundays were his favorite days. They used to walk to the market, hand in hand, choosing fruits, vegetables and spices. Then they would go home and cook while listening to jazz or bossa nova, while the smell of good food took over everything. She laughed at things he said without meaning to be funny. He smiled when he saw her dancing in the kitchen with a glass of wine in her hand. They felt like two pieces of a complex puzzle that had finally come together. Daniel, in his purest essence, believed that he had found in Elena not just a partner, but a point of balance. He no longer thought about life without her. I made plans, dreamed of children, trips, growing old with her. Every detail of the routine they built together was carefully crafted to last. Elena, in turn, felt more alive with him than she had ever felt before. Daniel wasn't the kind of man who overflowed with emotions, but he made her feel safe, valued, seen. For the first time, she had the feeling that she didn't need to fight for space, that her presence was fully accepted. That reassured her. And yet, there were times when she seemed to struggle with something inside, a subtle restlessness that crept into her eyes when he wasn't looking. At parties, Elena always seemed too present, talking to everyone, laughing loudly, dancing as if the music pulled her to a place where Daniel couldn't reach her. But that was never a real problem, at least not for him. Daniel understood, or believed he understood, that this was just her way of dealing with life. And, in a way, I admired that. After all, she made him leave his comfort zone, pushed him outside his limits, and he liked the feeling of being challenged. Both kept their careers on the rise. Daniel, with his architecture firm, had begun to receive major projects after years of almost obsessive dedication. Elena was at a respected law firm, where she had made a name for herself with her eloquence and ability to argue. Their schedules were busy, but they made a point of seeing each other every day, even if it was just for a few minutes. There was a mutual commitment, a commitment that went beyond words. Close friends often commented that the two seemed like they were made for each other, and when they themselves heard this, they exchanged silent looks that said it all without needing to say anything. When Daniel decided to ask her to marry him, no one was surprised. The proposal was made at an intimate dinner at home, on a cold night. Daniel prepared her favorite dish, decorated the room with candles and played soft music in the background. Upon seeing the ring, Elena cried. A real, emotional cry. She said yes almost in a whisper, and that night, they fell asleep holding each other, as if they were just one. The engagement brought new energy to the relationship. They started thinking about the ceremony, the honeymoon destination, the invitations, the details. But not only that, they began to rethink habits, adjust small incompatibilities, plan a life that went beyond the euphoria of their first years together. They bought a new car, opened a joint savings account, talked about children more often. Despite all the commitments, there was a constant effort to keep the romance alive. Letters left in unexpected places, notes on the mirror, flowers without a date set. Elena loved surprising Daniel with short messages during the day, and he always responded with an image from work or a phrase that made her smile. The relationship, at least from the outside, was solid, exemplary. There was respect, partnership, and, apparently, love. Daniel never imagined that anything could shake what they had built. Not out of blind trust, but because everything felt incredibly real. Her family adored him. Elena's parents saw Daniel as the ideal son-in-law, educated, hardworking, calm. Daniel's parents, although more discreet, showed genuine affection for Elena, who was always kind, helpful and lively. Family dinners were constant, full of laughter and light discussions about politics, cinema, literature. The holidays were celebrated with enthusiasm, and on none of these occasions was there any sign that anything was out of place. Even small conflicts, such as the fact that Daniel was extremely organized and Elena was somewhat impulsive and chaotic, were seen as part of the couple's charm. They balanced each other, everyone said that. However, there were days when Daniel felt that something was slipping through his fingers, as if the reality they lived in was always on the edge of a silent abyss. There were nuances, almost imperceptible details, a look that took a while to return to him during a conversation, a colder touch, a hurried response. Elena sometimes seemed distant, though never absent. It was as if he was physically there, but his thoughts were floating elsewhere. Daniel didn't talk about it, he preferred to keep it to himself. I was afraid of appearing insecure, jealous, small. I didn't want to give room for paranoia in a relationship that, until then, seemed so well built. Despite this, he continued to believe. After all relationships go through phases. Routine, work, the pressures of adult life, all of this could be the reason. Elena, in turn, maintained the same intensity as always, in parts. There were days when it was pure affection, pure attention. In others, it was silence and haste. But never disrespect. Never declared coldness. The love, apparently, was still there. And that was what Daniel chose to believe. After all, you don't build a story like theirs by chance. None of that could be illusory. Not after all. But the truth, as always, doesn't usually ask for permission. It first seeps through the cracks, settles into the silences and only then explodes. And although, until that moment, everything seemed as expected, there was something lurking. Something that grew slowly, that breathed deep in the darkness, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Because every relationship carries, in addition to love and dedication, its own abysses. And when you ignore the sound coming from them for too long, it's only a matter of time before he swallows it all. What Daniel didn't yet know was that his world, the one he believed he had shaped with care and dedication, was about to break apart in a way he could never have imagined. And when that happened, he would not only stop recognizing Elena, but also himself. Because there are betrayals that don't just kill love, they kill identity, trust, faith in others and in yourself. And some truths, when they emerge, have the power to set fire to everything once believed to be solid. Absolutely everything. Daniel had been dedicating himself to the most important project of the year, something that consumed his hours and made him return home with tired eyes and tense shoulders. Elena understood, at least that's what she said, and whenever he arrived, she greeted him with light smiles, quick kisses and ready meals. The routine, although hectic, seemed aligned. They still shared breakfast side by side, commenting on the weather, the day's commitments, the little trivialities that keep couples connected. But there was slowly a different atmosphere settling between them. It wasn't absence, nor was it blatant coldness. It was a subtle change, like a familiar perfume that gradually becomes cloying without explanation. Daniel began to notice that Elena smiled more on the phone than with him. That she went out with friends he'd never met. What messages arrived late at night, followed by a muffled laugh and a lost look at the cell phone screen. When he asked what it was, she responded naturally, memes, work groups, banal gossip. And for a while, he believed it. At the company, the days dragged by. Daniel no longer had the same focus as before. His mind was flying, occupied by thoughts that didn't seem to want to settle. He tried to ignore it, to focus on the projects, but something inside him warned that there was a noise hidden behind that apparently stable routine. At home, Elena showed more attention, more affection, more enthusiasm. She seduced him with the same intensity as at the beginning of their relationship, and for a few days, that left him at peace. He began to convince himself that his restlessness was just the result of tiredness, of exhaustion caused by overwork. But even with Elena's affection redoubled, he noticed that her gaze, sometimes, was elsewhere. A place he couldn't reach. One night, when he arrived home early from the office, he found the room lit only by the soft light of lamps. Elena looked beautiful, dressed in new lingerie and a dress he had never seen before. He said he was missing moments of just them, that he wanted to rekindle the passion, remember the beginning. She cooked his favorite dish, opened a wine they saved for special occasions and led him to the room with the same boldness he remembered from the first few months. It was all too perfect. So perfect that, the next day, the doubt returned with more force. Daniel couldn't explain it, but he had the strange sensation of being lulled by a well-told lie. That's when he started observing. Not in an invasive way, but silently. He began to notice the schedules, the smells, the details. He noticed that Elena had started coming home later on Wednesdays, always with different excuses. A happy hour here, a meeting there. The clothes were bolder, the perfume was more striking. She slept earlier, but used her cell phone until late, with the screen facing the opposite side of the bed. Daniel tried to talk, but the answers were always accompanied by a smile and a disarming phrase, "Honey, why this silly jealousy now?" And he gave in. Because he still loved her. Because I still wanted to believe. But love is not blind. He sees everything, he just chooses what he wants to see. Until you can no longer ignore it. It was on a Friday, upon arriving home, that Daniel saw something that he couldn't explain in an innocent way. A necklace on top of the dresser, a piece of jewelry he had never given. A new gift, without tags, that Elena didn't wear in front of him. And that gnawed at him. That same night, while she slept, he waited for sleep to weigh on her body and, carefully, unlocked her cell phone with his face. I knew it was wrong. I knew I was crossing a line. But I also knew I needed the truth. And it came like an avalanche. The messages left no room for doubt. They were long, intense, some romantic, others clearly intimate. There were nicknames, scheduled conversations, memories of recent meetings. Daniel felt the ground open beneath his feet. His hands shook, his chest hurt, his throat felt like he was swallowing shards of glass. It was real. Everything was there, before his eyes. The words she never said to him. The plans that didn't include his name. The photos sent, the words whispered via text, the "I miss you" messages sent at times when she was by your side. It was like watching your own love die in silence, with a magnifying glass revealing every detail of its agony. In the days that followed, Daniel pretended. He pretended that he didn't know, that he hadn't seen, that nothing had changed. He studied each step, each reaction, as if he were preparing an emotional project of destruction. He didn't confront Elena. He didn't scream, he didn't cry, he didn't accuse. Just watched. She seemed even looser, more in love, with someone else. He started leaving earlier and returning later. I invented commitments, created spaces to reflect. His heart was heavy, but he needed time to understand what to do. I didn't want to act impulsively. I wanted to know how far it went, who the man was behind the messages, what the true extent of it all was. It was on one of those nights that he decided to follow her. He said he was having a meeting out of town and left her believing he would be away for the night. But he stayed close, attentive. Waited. And she fell into the trap. She left shortly after dinner, too dressed up for the time, with a smile that wasn't meant for him. Daniel followed Elena's car to a restaurant with a sophisticated, discreet atmosphere, located in a neighborhood where they didn't usually go. He parked far away, entered from the side and sat at the bar, with a direct view of the room. And then he saw it. She was there. Sitting at the table, in front of a man with a short beard and refined appearance, someone who exuded confidence. The two laughed, toasted, exchanged intimate looks. She touched his arm like she did with Daniel years ago. The same hand, the same look, the same way of smiling with half-closed eyes. But for another. Daniel remained motionless, his body paralyzed between the impulse to confront and the desire to understand. He observed everything in silence, until the man took a small box out of his pocket and placed it on the table. Elena put her hands to her mouth, her eyes lit up, and then she opened it. It was an alliance. The man leaned over and said something Daniel couldn't hear. But the gesture was enough. This wasn't just a case. It was something bigger. Something she accepted. She said yes. Not with words, but with the gesture of accepting the jewel, of letting it be placed on your finger. With the smile of someone committing to a new beginning. Daniel's mind spiraled. Everything seemed like a distorted simulation. The promises made, the plans made, the dreams shared, now crumbled before him. And even with his heart broken, he calmly stood up, crossed the room with firm steps and stopped in front of their table. Silence fell for a second that seemed like an eternity. Elena looked up, and when she saw him there, she felt the blood drain from her face. The cup he held trembled in his hand. The other man just raised his eyebrows in surprise. Daniel stared at the two and then, with a voice filled with dry pain, said, "Surprise. I discovered everything. I caught you two here. Now I'm going to reveal to everyone who you really are." She couldn't say anything. She remained silent, caught between shock and shame. The man looked at her, then looked at Daniel, as if trying to understand what was really happening. But what neither of them knew was that there, at that table, in front of the scene they thought they controlled, they were just at the beginning of something much bigger. Because Daniel's true reason for being there, the true plan behind his presence, had not yet been revealed. And when it is, nothing, absolutely nothing, will be able to erase the damage that is about to happen. Elena's hand was still hovering over the wine glass when Daniel threw the words like sharp blades into the thick silence of the restaurant. The impact was immediate. The ambient sound faded behind a bubble of tension growing around the three. She couldn't breathe properly, her wide eyes betrayed a fear that she tried to hide with an upright posture, but her skin betrayed the truth, the blood had drained from her face, her fingers were shaking and her mouth was searching for words that simply weren't coming. The man in front of him, whose confidence until then had been unshakable, was now frowning with calculated confusion, but there was something in his gaze, it wasn't exactly surprise. It was as if he knew that one day it would happen. As if he was already prepared for this confrontation. Daniel, on the other hand, didn't scream. He didn't lose control. His face was a mask of containment. But his eyes burned with a pain that only those who have been betrayed understand. The pain of realizing that everything he had experienced was being used as a setting for a play whose script he never read. Elena was the first to try to speak, her voice breaking as it came out, as if something was squeezing her throat from the inside out. She said she could explain it, that it wasn't what it seemed, that she was confused, that she found it by chance, that it was all too impulsive. But the words ran over each other, incoherent, fragile. Daniel just looked at her, in silence. Until, with a low and firm voice, she released a sentence that ended any attempt at her control over the narrative. "Did you meet him by chance, Elena? Even after I arranged the dinner, chose the restaurant, organized every detail of this evening? Because this meeting was my gift to you." She blinked, trying to understand, as if she hadn't heard correctly. The man in front of him then moved back slightly in his chair, his lips pressing together, avoiding eye contact with both of them. Daniel then turned to him, calling him by name with precision. "And you knew exactly what you were doing. But I think now the time has come for us to reveal the role we each had in this performance." The silence was broken by the sound of the silver bracelet Elena wore hitting lightly against the glass, like a nervous pendulum. She mouthed his name, astonished, looking from her lover to her husband. Daniel then moved a little closer to the table, placing his cell phone on it. "For months I've known everything. Every message. Every meeting. Every touch you offered him while you lay in my bed saying you loved me. But you don't understand, Elena, I didn't come here to fight for you. I didn't come to beg you, nor to punish you. I came to free you, from the lie you told yourself." She tried to get up, but Daniel raised his hand, not to stop her, but as if asking that the last act of a play not be interrupted. "You know what's most ironic? He was the one who reached out to me." "That's right. Your ex. He contacted me months ago. He said he thought you were different. That he suspected you still had feelings for him. At the time, of course, I thought it was teasing. But then I realized that maybe it was exactly what I needed. A chance to know. To see how far you would go. And he agreed." The lover now had his eyes downcast, clearly uncomfortable, like someone who knows he's just been backed into a wall. Elena looked at him as if he had become another man in front of her. Daniel continued, with the calm of someone who has nothing left to lose. Every date was arranged by me. Every message, driven by me. Every sweet word you heard, was scripted by me. You didn't go back to him. You fell into the trap I created with him. Elena's face disfigured within seconds. Anger mixed with humiliation took over his expression. She tried to regain control, but there was no more control. She was naked, exposed, faced with her own emotional greed. The man then finally spoke. He said he initially accepted out of curiosity, that he didn't believe she would give in so easily, that he didn't think she would cheat. But as she gave in, he felt something different. It wasn't passion. It was a shame. He said he saw the same sparkle in her eyes that she had years ago, when she loved him, but now, it was just a reflection of emptiness. Daniel remained silent as the two looked at each other. Elena now tried to hold on to any shred of dignity. She said that it was all a mistake, that maybe it was her fault, but that Daniel was also absent, that the marriage was lukewarm, that she felt invisible. Daniel didn't respond. He just picked up his cell phone from the table and opened the gallery. He showed her images. Prints of messages, recorded audio, photos of the two in intimate moments. Her breathing became heavy. She whispered that he was watching her. Daniel nodded. I said yes. He said that at some point he stopped trusting her, but before leaving, he needed to know how far she was capable of going. And she went far. Too far. Elena tried to justify herself, crying, saying that she felt alone, that she was human, that she had weaknesses. But Daniel just watched her, as if trying to memorize that moment. Not for revenge. But to never forget where it all ended. The restaurant was already watching them with hungry eyes. Some pretended not to pay attention, others openly stared. But nobody said anything. Daniel then placed an envelope on the table. In it, the divorce papers. She choked on a suppressed sob. He said he didn't want that, that they could recover, that everything could be rebuilt. But he was already on his feet. He looked into her eyes one last time and spoke, with a serenity so cold that it chilled her spine. You destroyed something that took me years to build. It wasn't the kisses, it wasn't the lies. It was the ease with which you replaced me. It was the comfort with which you lay in another bed while I still called you home. She tried to grab his arm, but he pulled away, walking out of the restaurant without looking back. Outside, the night was absurdly silent. As Daniel walked down the sidewalk, he felt a weight lift off of him. It wasn't relief. It was grief that had finally taken shape. The pain that now had a face, a name, a scene. But there was something more to come. Something that had not yet been revealed. Because the most devastating secret of all, still remained hidden. And when it comes to light, it will forever change not just Elena's story, but everyone around her. Because neither she, nor her ex-husband, nor those who thought they knew the truth, were prepared for what was really hidden behind all that acting. The game wasn't over yet. He had just started. The path to the car was taken in long but silent steps, as if Daniel was avoiding waking up something that was still sleeping inside him. There was no rush, but there was no hesitation either. The rain began to fall thinly, almost timidly, as if the sky respected the moment when everything, in fact, fell apart. He unlocked the doors, got in and rested his hands on the steering wheel for a few seconds before starting the engine. Eyes fixed on the cloudy windshield, breathing slow, thick, trying to find an immediate meaning in the rarefied air for what had just happened. But there wasn't. And he knew he wouldn't come. Not yet. Not that night. Meanwhile, inside the restaurant, Elena remained sitting, her gaze lost, her mind in collapse. The man in front of him stood up, disconcerted. He tried to say something, but gave up. He paid the bill, left an absurd tip and left like someone running from a fire. She stayed. Alone. Look. Judged in silence. But even that didn't seem to affect her. I was numb, my mind was trying to chase the previous minutes, trying to put together the puzzle of humiliation. Her hands were shaking, and when she tried to pick up her bag, she dropped the glass, which was still half full. The sound of glass shattering made everyone turn around, but no one helped her. She got up, proud and trembling, and went out into the rain, without an umbrella, with her dress stuck to her body and her eyes still blurry. He stopped outside, looked around as if he didn't know where else to go, and sat down on the sidewalk bench, letting the water run down his hair and face, mixing with his tears. For the first time, I felt like I was truly alone. That same night, Daniel did not return home. He drove aimlessly until he stopped at a simple hotel, a little away. He wasn't ready to face the emptiness of the apartment, nor her traces scattered throughout every room. He asked for a room on the top floor, avoided eye contact with the receptionist and passed the magnetic key through the door with a coldness that surprised him. Once inside, he turned on the lights, took off his shoes and looked in the mirror. He didn't recognize himself. It wasn't just the appearance. It was something deeper. As if it had been remodeled, forced to mature a decade in a few hours. He sat down in the armchair and finally felt his body give way. The pain didn't come in screams. It came in silence. In the silence of those who understood that, from now on, everything would be different. But there was something still hanging in the balance, something he needed to close. And for that, I would need to go back. 2 days later, Elena called him dozens of times. Long messages, full of guilt, justifications, promises. He didn't respond to any. He was just waiting for the right moment. The divorce had already been filed, the documents had been delivered. But there was something he needed to see with his own eyes, something that couldn't just be part of his imagination. And that was why, that afternoon, he returned to that corner cafe where it all started. The same place where, years ago, Elena rushed in, dropped her bag on the floor and he, on instinct, helped collect the scattered items. It was there that she smiled for the first time. It was there that he believed that this woman would change his life. Now, sitting in the same corner, with the same cappuccino cooling in front of him, he was waiting for someone he hadn't seen in years. She arrived on time. Tall, elegant, discreet. He didn't look around. He entered and went straight to the table where he was. Upon seeing him, her eyes showed no surprise. Just a slight sadness, as if regretting that everything had culminated in that reunion. He sat down in front of him, took off his gloves and just said, "I thought you were going to look for me." Daniel didn't respond right away. He studied every feature, every gesture, as if he were meeting that woman for the first time. She was the ex-wife of the man with whom Elena had had the affair. But more than that, she was the missing link, the final piece of a puzzle he still didn't fully understand. The silence between them was interrupted by a simple request, "Tell me what you know." She took a deep breath, adjusted her posture and began to speak, bluntly, as if the truth had waited too long to surface. "When he started getting close to you, it wasn't by chance. He knew who you were. He knew who you were married to. And he knew Elena was still vulnerable in his presence. She never got over their history. What you don't know is that he told me he was changed, that he wanted to rebuild his life. I wanted to believe it. But slowly, I realized something was wrong. He was obsessed. Not with her. But with you." Daniel frowned. "For me?" She nodded. "Yes. He envied you. Your career. Your reputation. The stability you built with it. He didn't want Elena. He wanted to destroy what you had. And when he realized he could do that by getting closer to her, he saw an opportunity there." Daniel was silent, processing the information. That changed everything. Not just the context of the betrayal, but the very story of the pain he felt. "But there's more," she continued. "You don't know who he really is. The name he gave you is not the real one. He has another past, another history, which has been erased. He has done this before. With other women. With other families. Daniel stood still, absorbing every word. I found out by chance. A friend of mine, who works with financial records, recognized his face from an old report. Involving not just adultery, but manipulation, emotional fraud, psychological control. He assumes identities, approaches, causes chaos, and disappears. Daniel's blood ran cold. So he used her. She nodded. He saw in her the fragility he needed. The unresolved desire, the vanity, the insecurity. And he used it all against you. Because, in the end, the target was never her. It was you. Her ruin was just the path. Daniel closed his eyes. A mixture of anger, compassion and disgust took over his body. Everything made sense now. Every gesture. Every word. The ease with which Elena surrendered came not just from an old desire, but from a carefully constructed manipulation. A game where everyone was a piece, except him, who had become the entire board. Leaving the cafe, Daniel walked slowly. The rain was falling again, fine, persistent. The world was spinning the same way, but he felt that its inner axis had changed forever. He passed through streets that once seemed familiar, but now seemed foreign to him. Everything I thought I knew had been dismantled, piece by piece. But inside him, something new began to emerge. It wasn't revenge. It was clarity. And with it, a new purpose. Because now he knew he hadn't just been betrayed. It had been used. And I wouldn't let that go unpunished. That same night, Elena was waiting for him at home. He hadn't responded to the messages, but she knew he would come. I needed to listen, try to justify, rebuild something from the pieces. When he entered, she was sitting on the sofa, her eyes swollen and her face haggard. She stood up slowly, hopefully. But before she could speak, Daniel looked at her and said firmly, "He didn't love you. He used you. And you gave me into his hands." She remained static. I didn't understand. What are you talking about? He approached, without violence, but with intensity. You were part of a plan. Part of a game. He didn't want you. He wanted to get to me. And you were the means. She brought her hands to her mouth, stepping back. No. It's not possible, Daniel nodded. Yes it is. And you allowed it. Because you wanted to. Because it was never about love. It was about ego. About vanity. And now, we all lost. She fell onto the couch, her shoulders shaking in suppressed crying. But Daniel was unmoved. I knew that wasn't regret. It was shame. It was the weight of truth being placed, for the first time, on her shoulders. He turned, walked to the door and before leaving, he said, "He's gone. And I'm not going to look for him. Because now I know. I know who he is. I know who you are. And finally, I know who I am." And in that moment, Daniel didn't look back. There was nothing else to see. Just the sound of the door closing and the knowledge that, although marked forever, he would come out in one piece. Because the truth sets you free. Even if it hurts. Even if it destroys. She frees. The house was plunged into a thick silence, as if even the furniture were embarrassed by what had happened. The curtains remained closed, the room still exhaled the smell of Elena's perfume, mixed with the cold coffee forgotten in the kitchen and the memories suspended in the air, as if everything there had stopped at the exact moment Daniel crossed the door. The plants on the balcony withered in silence, the books were still stacked on the bookshelf, the paintings still showed smiles from a past that now seemed like a pathetic performance. He had returned not to reconnect, but to have closure. He was there to pick up some clothes, get documents and leave behind everything that reminded him of what he once believed was love. Even so, it was impossible not to feel the weight of each step inside that home. Because, even though he knew that everything had been built on fragile foundations, seeing everything about to collapse so clearly made something inside him wince in pain. But there was something different now. He was no longer the man betrayed, exposed, filled with rage. This was someone who had gone beyond the limit of what was bearable and was dealing with what was left, the truth and its consequences. While gathering his things, Daniel noticed an envelope on the bed, with his handwriting written in the upper left corner. It was Elena's. He hesitated. The desire was to ignore it, leave it there and not give her any more chance to manipulate her pain. But something compelled him to open it. Inside was a handwritten letter. The words trembled, but they were there, one by one, like someone writing trying to vomit out everything they didn't have the courage to say. She apologized, as expected. But they were not excuses for betrayal. They were excuses for not being able to see herself with the eyes he saw her with. She said she felt small next to him, even when he tried to lift her up. That she saw herself erased behind the glow of his generosity, the stability, the calm he offered. She said that loving him also meant confronting her own holes, because he was too complete, and she, unfinished. She talked about the moments when she wanted to be the ideal woman for him, but couldn't maintain the image. The letter did not attempt to get back together, nor did it beg for forgiveness. It was just a request, that he know that betrayal was not about a lack of love, but about an excess of emptiness. Daniel closed the envelope with an ambiguous feeling. It was impossible to know whether to feel sorry or relieved. Because even though I understood her insecurities, that didn't justify anything. And yet, he understood. And that hurt even more. The following week, the divorce procedures went smoothly. Elena didn't dispute anything, she didn't look any further. He signed the papers, kept his distance, but asked, through his lawyer, that he could keep the apartment. Daniel gave in without resistance. Not because I didn't care, but because I couldn't stand living surrounded by ghosts any longer. He collected what was left, transferred his savings to a separate account and then decided to disappear for a while. He chose any destination, rented an isolated house and spent weeks in silence. The days were filled with solitary walks, reading and the constant attempt to rebuild oneself. There was no rush. There was no plan. There was just him, finally just himself. And for the first time in months, he began to sleep with some peace. Away from everything, he rediscovered small parts of himself that had been swallowed up by the routine and pain that had imposed itself over the last few years. I wrote with no intention of showing it to anyone. I wrote down feelings, insights, memories I wanted to keep and others I needed to expel. And in the middle of this process, he ended up bumping into a modest cafe, run by a woman with dark eyes and a restrained smile, someone who treated him kindly without seeming interested in anything other than serving a good coffee. Her name was Laura, and her presence was silent but comforting. He didn't ask about the past, he didn't invade, he was just there, like a point of peace in the midst of the internal storm that Daniel was still going through. Little by little, they started talking more. First about coffee, then about books, then about scars that didn't need to be said out loud to be understood. She also carried stories she preferred not to relive. And in this pact of not asking, the two found a form of lightness that they didn't know was possible. Daniel didn't fall in love quickly. He didn't look for a replacement for Elena, nor did he try to fill the void with distractions. Laura was not an escape. It was a date. And this made the feeling that was born there grow slowly, with firm roots. The days they spent together were simple, quiet dinners, low laughs, confidences exchanged little by little. With her, Daniel didn't need to be strong all the time. I could tell when I felt pain, when I still dreamed of scenes I no longer wanted to remember. And she listened, without trying to fix it. That was what won him over. The fact that Laura didn't want to heal him, just accompany him while he healed. The feeling changed, subtly, until one day, as they walked in silence, she touched his hand with her fingertips and he didn't flinch. Smiled. And he felt something he thought he had lost forever, the desire to move on. Meanwhile, Elena's life took on more nebulous contours. The man who involved her in the plan against Daniel had completely disappeared. He blocked his contacts, disappeared from networks, disconnected the phone number he used. She tried to find him again, to confront him, to understand if at least part of what she experienced with him was true. But he got no response. Mutual friends pretended not to know, or really didn't know. Alone in her apartment, surrounded by memories that now seemed damning, she was slowly consumed by guilt. The loneliness was not just physical, but emotional. There were no more masks to wear. No excuses. Her parents, who had once looked up to her as an example, now could barely hold a conversation with her without the air becoming heavy. The friends from before have disappeared. Some out of judgment, others out of simply not knowing how to deal with the discomfort of your presence. And in the silence of that house that had once been a symbol of the future, now everything smelled of ending. Elena immersed herself in an almost obsessive process of self-analysis. He sought therapy. She tried to understand the reasons that not even she knew how to formulate. He wrote letters to Daniel that he never sent. He tried to write down on paper all the words he wished he had said, but none of them seemed enough. And even in the face of regret, she knew, there was no going back. And maybe that was the real punishment. Knowing that there was nothing that could be done to rebuild what he destroyed with his own hands. In the middle of a random night, she woke up sweaty, with her heart racing, and looked around as if expecting to find someone there. But all he saw was his own image reflected in the hallway mirror. And there, looking at herself with swollen eyes and a tired face, she understood that this would be her new company. The guilt. Repentance. And the awareness that it was too easy to cross the line. It was difficult to return. Daniel, on the other hand, began to quietly reorganize his life. He changed address, sold the part of the apartment he had left, opened a small consultancy and started choosing the projects he wanted to tackle. I no longer wanted to drown myself in work to forget about life. I wanted to build something new with awareness, with presence. He began traveling sporadically with Laura, discovering new places and rediscovering the pleasure of living without needing to prove anything to anyone. His eyes still carried shadows, but now there was also brightness. He learned to live with the memory without allowing it to rule his days. From time to time, I still came across news about Elena, but I never looked for it. If something came to him, it was by chance. And increasingly, these accidents stopped mattering. The diminishing action of it all did not come with euphoria or vengeful justice. It came with reality. With maturity. With the painful acceptance that not all wounds close without scars. But some scars, no matter how ugly, are reminders that you survived. And Daniel, now, was someone who survived more lightly. What happened to Elena was still hers. Her story, her mistake, the path she chose to follow. And as much as he had been a victim in that plot, he no longer saw himself as a defeated man. He had something few could achieve after a fall, peace. And peace is sometimes worth more than any revenge. But deep down, there was one last thing going on. A peace that still needed to be put in place so that everything could finally close with the necessary impact. Because life, as Daniel now knew, didn't leave loose ends for long. And destiny, indeed, was preparing the last turn. It was on an ordinary day, one of those that promised nothing more than silence and continuity, that Daniel received an unexpected envelope, left under the door of his new home. The paper, yellowed at the edges, had no sender, just his name written in precise handwriting. He hesitated for a few seconds before opening it. I had already learned to respect the silences of destiny and distrust sudden returns. When he unfolded the letter, he found a single note and an unidentified metal key inside. The words were few, but carried with a weight that directly affected poorly buried memories. You need to see it for yourself. The answer you didn't know you were looking for is where it all began. There was no signature. But there was intention. And it was impossible to ignore her. The key took him to an old address, an out-of-the-way property that he vaguely recognized as being from the days when Elena was still in touch with a distant aunt, someone she rarely spoke of. The place looked abandoned, with the rusty fence and weeds growing around it. When he opened the door, he smelled dust and old wood. The air carried the density of something that hadn't been moved in years. He walked carefully, his footsteps echoing across the creaking floor. In the back room, he found a cardboard box, the lid covered with a purple scarf. Inside it, there was a series of old documents, photos, letters, and, at the bottom, a flash drive. He took everything and left there with his chest tight with an anxiety he couldn't name. Back in the safety of his home, with Laura gone for a short trip, Daniel connected the device to his computer, his heart beating a strange rhythm. Inside, he found only a video. Untitled. No date. Play. On the screen appeared the face of the man who had become the center of everything, Elena's ex-husband, the manipulator, the architect of the trap. He was younger, maybe 10 years younger. The video looked homemade, recorded in a hurry, in a poorly lit environment. He spoke directly to the camera, as if he were leaving a record that he never intended to show, but which, for some reason, ended up being kept. And then, he started talking. He told his story like someone who confesses more than he declares. He talked about how he met Elena, about the fascination she had, about the beginning of the relationship which, according to him, never had a solid foundation. He said it was intense, but empty, full of dreams that changed shape according to convenience. But the most shocking thing came next. He claimed that everything had been premeditated from the moment he found out that she had remarried. He said that, seeing her happy with someone else, he awakened a desire for revenge that he didn't even know how to carry. Not against her, but against the idea that someone, like Daniel, could give her the life he didn't. His presence in her networks, his sudden return to her life, his approach, everything had been part of a plan, cruel, meticulous, sick. He wanted to destroy her from the inside, then disappear and let her finish the job herself. And that's what he did. Daniel paused the video. He was breathing with difficulty. Played again. And the man continued, as if pouring out the poison that fed him. She said she knew Elena would give in, because she was still trapped in the most fragile versions of herself. That all you had to do was turn on the right buttons, insecurity, vanity, nostalgia, and it would come. And it came. He confessed that, while he was winning her back, he got closer to Daniel too. That he had investigated his life, understood his movements, his weaknesses. I didn't want her back, he said, I wanted to see him bleed. The video ended with a brief smile and a long silence. Daniel stayed there, staring at the screen, until it went out. There was nothing else. No legal proof, no clearly defined crime. Just the raw truth. The story behind the story. The origin of the scam. Sitting in the living room, with the rain hitting the windows, he felt a calm unlike any before. It wasn't peace, but it wasn't pain either. It was as if I had finally found the last piece. Confirmation that everything, in fact, was planned. Which wasn't crazy. Not an exaggeration. It was real. The plot, the betrayal, the game. Elena's voice echoed in her memory, saying she felt empty, lost. And he understood, perhaps she had been both victim and accomplice. And that was the bitterest part. Knowing that their love was, in part, used as bait. And that she, without realizing it, handed him over. That night, Laura returned from her trip and found Daniel on the balcony, with a cup of tea in his hands and his eyes fixed on the horizon. She walked over quietly, sat down next to him, and after a few minutes, asked if he wanted to talk about whatever was heavy there. He looked at her, with melancholy tenderness, and said, "Today I buried a part of my story once and for all. And for the first time, I think I can breathe clearly." She didn't respond. She just intertwined her fingers with his, in a simple gesture, but full of meaning. And in that touch, he understood that there was room for a new beginning. No rush. No pressure. Just the possibility of something that was born with truth. Weeks later, Elena asked to meet him. The insistence was firm, but respectful. Daniel hesitated, but accepted. They met in a park, under the shadows of trees. She was visibly haggard, her features marked by time and consequences. There was no more makeup, no more rehearsed posture. Just a broken woman in front of a man she once loved and hurt. She thanked him for agreeing to see her. He said he knew he didn't deserve it, but he needed it. I needed to ask for forgiveness with my voice, with my eyes, with my presence. Daniel heard her. No interruptions. No judgment. When she finished, he just said, "You didn't destroy my world, Elena. You showed me how vulnerable I was to the one I loved. And that made me stronger." She cried. Not for forgiveness, but for the dignity with which he had overcome everything. And there, at the end of a conversation that no longer needed to happen, they both said goodbye. Not with a hug, not with promises. But with a long look, which said more than any words. On the way home, Daniel drove with the windows open. The wind cut your face, but there was pleasure in it. The feeling of moving with time itself, with one's own history rewritten in honest scars. When he arrived, he found Laura reading in the living room. She looked up, smiled slightly, and he came closer, kissing her forehead. I didn't say anything. And it didn't need to. Because life was finally at peace with him. And he, with her. But something inside said that the story still had one last revelation. One last gesture. Not to cause pain, but to end the cycle with the emotional justice it deserved. And that last piece was about to emerge. Time, with its relentless slowness, was the only thing capable of organizing the chaos left behind. And like everything in life that goes through such an intense rupture, the pieces that once formed a solid scenario never return to the same places. But some find a new, unexpected fit, perhaps lighter, more sincere, more human. Daniel moved on with his life without looking back. Not out of bitterness or contempt, but because I had already understood that some chapters do not deserve rereading. Instead of brooding, he decided to walk. With eyes focused on the present, with a heart in no rush to love, but also without fear of doing it again. The truth had been told, the hurts acknowledged, and the pain, although it still left traces in his memory, had been transformed into wisdom. He continued his discreet routine, involved in new projects, reclaiming the pleasure of working only with what he really wanted, without external pressure, without carrying the burden of proving something to someone. Laura was by his side without demanding promises or protagonism. It was a constant but gentle presence. The complicity between them grew based on honest exchange, silent acceptance, and this made them stronger every day. The love that was born between the two was not explosive, but mature. A love that didn't need to be announced to be felt. And in this new chapter, Daniel was finally able to recognize that it was possible to start over without losing the essence of what he once was, just allowing himself to be different. Elena, on the other hand, took a much rougher path. The consequences of his choices continued to manifest themselves in unexpected ways. The apartment where he insisted on staying began to gradually crumble, not in the walls, but in the memories that suffocated each room. Daniel's absence echoed louder than his presence had ever screamed. She tried to rescue friendships, rebuild bridges that she herself had burned down, but was received with crossed looks, with distrust, with awkward silences. He began to withdraw more, to go out less, to avoid places that reminded him of the times when everything was lighter. He tried to resume his career with the same strength as before, but the emotional exhaustion compromised his performance. Colleagues noticed his wavering, his lack of focus, his poorly concealed sadness. Some still tried to help her, others just walked away. At some point, he left his job. She said she needed time, air, to find herself again. And there began his true punishment. Not a punishment imposed by someone, but one that comes from within, that no one can alleviate. She faced anxiety attacks, sleepless nights, revisiting every moment, every choice, trying to find at what point she stopped being herself and became just a distorted version of what she would like to be. Even with therapeutic support, some wounds simply do not heal as expected. And loneliness, when it becomes a mirror, forces us to face truths that no one wants to see. Years passed and, on an ordinary afternoon, she saw him from afar. Daniel was crossing the street with Laura at his side, smiling as they carried grocery bags. The way he looked at her, the way she laid her head on his shoulder as they waited for the light to change, it all pierced Elena like a blade. There was nothing more she could do. She didn't come any closer. Didn't call. Didn't try to contact. He just watched and, in silence, understood that this was the real outcome. Daniel had followed. And she, no matter how hard she tried to get back on her feet, would forever carry the memory of having destroyed what, perhaps, was the only truly solid thing she ever had. The image of him leaving with another woman, light, calm, was the last time she saw him. She returned home alone, with slow steps and teary eyes. And there, in the silence of the apartment that now seemed emptier than ever, she whispered to herself that she hoped, one day, to forgive herself. Even if the world never did. As for the man who manipulated everything, his whereabouts remained uncertain for a long time. Until, in a report from an investigative newspaper, Daniel recognized the face among those involved in a corporate fraud scandal abroad. He used another name, another identity, but the look was the same. The article talked about fake accounts, fake relationships, destruction of reputations. A cycle that repeated itself. He had finally been arrested during a joint operation between security agencies from different countries. He was being accused of multiple financial crimes, criminal association, as well as emotional manipulation for hidden purposes. The face on the screen, now aged and without the charm of before, carried the expression of someone who had lost control over the game itself. Daniel was not pleased to hear this. Didn't celebrate. He just turned off the television, closed his eyes for a few seconds and exhaled slowly. It was as if, finally, a door had been locked from the outside. It didn't touch him anymore. It didn't hurt him. It was closed. On the 3-year anniversary of the day he left his old house without looking back, Daniel and Laura traveled to a place by the sea. Simple, without luxury, but with a view that calmed any internal noise. On the sand, lying under the sound of the waves, they talked about the time, about plans, about everything and nothing at the same time. Laura gently mentioned that maybe now would be a good time to think about moving in together. He didn't respond immediately. He took her hand, intertwined their fingers, and just said, "I think so." There was no promise. There was a desire. And that was enough. Because, after all, they learned that love is not in grand gestures, but in the constancy of those who choose to stay every day. In the end, everyone had the destiny they wrote with their own decisions. Elena continued trying to pick up the pieces of a version of herself that no longer existed. The ex-husband was confronted by the laws he evaded for so long. And Daniel, the one who was once betrayed, rebuilt, deceived and finally freed, followed. Not with the same heart as before, but with an even stronger one. Because he survived the greatest pain anyone can feel, the breach of trust. And yet, he chose not to become bitter. He chose love. He chose the truth. He chose to continue with dignity. If you've made it this far, I want to know your opinion. What did you think of this story? Which part moved you the most? Leave your comment below, it is very important to us. Take advantage and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the next stories. Here, in each episode, you will find real emotions, engaging stories and surprising endings. And never forget, this channel does not support any type of betrayal. Our goal is to show how wrong choices, based on lies, have profound consequences on the lives of everyone involved. Until the next story.